Welcome to the Patriot Perspective. My name is Gregory Lykov, and I'm joined here with my co-host Ofer Adar.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to September 26th iteration of the Patriot Perspective. A lot of news to get into over the past couple of days. As we saw, and this is the elephant in the room, we had the convention of the United Nations in New York, and Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, spoke for a while. We're going to look at his remarks and some of the reactions to it, some of the other remarks from other world leaders like Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara in the meeting between Israeli and Syrian officials. And on a related note, of course, the agreement signed between Turkey and the United States, also very important for the region. We'll look at the FBI indictments of James Comey. So, yeah, there's lots to get into today. I think we should start with the UN and the resulting drama. So, kick us off.
Yeah, definitely. So first off, for anyone who does not know what is going on right now in New York City, for the last 3 days, I believe, it has been the UN General Assembly, which basically means that a bunch of the nation's leaders and UN representatives and diplomats go to the UN and form a meeting. Now, the result of this meeting has been absolutely abysmal. I mean, the only good things or things that actually happened, and I don't mean good things, this is actually not a good thing, I guess, is the escalator that broke down, which proved Donald Trump's fitness in climbing stairs, and also the teleprompter that broke down. So really the UN has absolutely sucked, and there has nothing been good that has happened in the last 3 days. Obviously, you heard all the condemnation of Israel, all the nations calling Israel a genocide state, and no pushback from that. So to address the specific point that you brought up, and that was really Israel and the UN. So today we saw at about 9 a.m. Benjamin Netanyahu actually spoke at the United Nations in front of a crowd. It wasn't a big crowd, but it was a
Yeah.
crowd. Most people walked out. Unsurprisingly, the UN is filled up with people who are very against Israel and who hate Israel. But I actually had a close colleague of mine actually attend this speech, and it was truly wonderful. I think he spoke wonderfully. He Something that stuck out to me is that he really made an emphasis on changing the Iranian regime. I think that was very important. He talked about Iran. He said it was the number one state sponsor of terror, which Trump agrees with. And not only that, but there actually needs to be a regime change. And that is something that I found very interesting. And of course, he talked about many other aspects of the Gaza war, specifically to do with other countries. He said something along the lines of other countries who are not supporting Israel are indicting themselves, not actually Israel. And that was just a very powerful line. But Ofer, after you watched the speech, what was your initial reactions? Did you think it was effective? Anything important said there? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's not really going to change any hearts or minds. It's more so just laying out there a recap of what's been done over the past year
Mhm.
since his last speech. There's been a massive degrading of the axis of resistance, as Iran refers to it, and of this proxy network that was meant to deplete Israel's ability to defend itself. And so Netanyahu just goes through in the speech how one by one he was able to take out those dominoes, and how in the process, this is what he says. He claims that he's essentially doing dirty work for other Western nations that prefer not to deal with those groups or with
Yeah.
those nations directly. So something that he said is that, like, in private, a lot of these countries, and I'd say probably the ones in Western Europe are the ones he's referring to. They're privately thanking him and privately cooperating, because we know that during the last Iran war, there was tacit cooperation between Israel, France, UK, Saudi Arabia. But they're not going to say it publicly, of course. Publicly, they walked out of the stage because it's all about the optics. And so that's just one perspective on what happened in the speech. And yeah, there was a huge emphasis on Iran, as you said, and how the framework and sort of the groundwork, I would add, for a regime change has already been put in motion, with the proxy network getting not completely destroyed, but certainly degraded. And with the first round of conflict in June between Israel and Iran. And so, yes, there's a huge push now for a regime change in Iran, a huge push for another war to resume. And that can happen certainly after the snapback mechanism comes into place, or once the GCPOA expires on October of this year. And then there will be a much higher likelihood of a war starting. And so Netanyahu is already sort of getting everything underway, diplomatically speaking, prepared for such a scenario. And the other thing that was significant is the fact that he placed these loudspeakers on the perimeter of the border with Gaza. So he tried to basically have it in such a way where people in Gaza could hear the speech. And then he gave like a direct address to the hostages in Hebrew, trying to tell them that they're not forgotten. And so he's still maintaining that as a central tenet of the Israeli war objectives, because he needs to at least say that publicly in order to retain internal support for the continued war effort. So that's pretty much my synopsis of what's been going on over there.
Yeah, so you actually made a great point there, Ofer, and that was with the JCPOA, which was also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the infamous nuclear deal, and all the other names Democrats and Republicans had for it. But it was signed under Obama in 2015, and something that people need to understand is that this nuclear deal, while the U.S. did take back their or they left it under the first Trump administration, this nuclear deal has been in effect with a bunch of other countries, European powers, global superpowers, everyone basically. And that means that Iran was still able, over the past few years, to, get money for something that they're not doing, for continuing their nuclear program, basically funding their nuclear program again. So something that I actually didn't see much of it done is that Trump didn't pressure other nations to drop out of the nuclear deal. Not enough, at least, because no other nation really did drop out of the nuclear deal, and that's something he should have emphasized in his first term. But adding on to that, we do see that there will be a snapback, especially after the JCPOA is out in October. There's going to be a limited amount of funds. Already, the resources are limited. We have droughts, we have electricity shortages, we have gas shortages. Because it's just an inefficient economy right now in Iran. So there's a big issue with that, and we know that if this JCPOA money runs out, the government is going to flip. And something like the Green Revolution in 2009 could actually happen again. And obviously, for our viewers that are familiar with the history of Iran, the Green Revolution failed because of Obama, basically, in overthrowing the regime. But it was the last time the regime actually had a threat against it in Iran. But Ofer, what makes this situation different? If, let's say, Iran goes to war, is what happened in the Green Revolution going to repeat, or is Iran actually going to have a regime change?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the timeline now, Russia is desperately trying to get a new arrangement sorted out in order to prevent the snapback sanctions from coming into effect. So as we know, the E3 nations, they voted on initiating that, and that means that they have to pass it through the United Nations Security Council. And once the UN Security Council votes on it, and last time there was a vote, the Russians didn't have enough support to block that sort of initiative. It means that the UN as a whole will be forced to enact those wide sweeping sanctions onto Iran. And that includes finance, it includes military arms, it
Yeah.
includes energy. And that's the thing. In October, it expires, meaning that Iran has less of an interest post October to abide by the terms of the deal. For now, they still need to let the IAEA inspect it, because then they can use that as an excuse to, of course, not force the UN to enact those sanctions on it, which would obviously force China and Russia to enact sanctions on Iran, which they're not going to do either way. And so, with that being said, there's probably not going to be anything significant that happens before the JCPOA expires in October. And then after it expires, the European nations' assets located in those countries that will be frozen again. There's a lot of second or third party deals that go through those countries, and then Iran could use that as like an avenue to sell. So yeah, there's a huge issue for the Iranian economy, even if the entire UN doesn't enact the sanctions, even if it's only Western Europe. And so that's going to increase pressure internally on Iran, because you're going to see rising energy prices.
Yeah.
You're going to see, again, continued issues with droughts, and going into the winter season, it's going to be difficult when it comes to heating homes. So that's the sort of conditions that you need for civil strife. But who knows? Because it perhaps may not be enough, because as we know, it failed with the Green Revolution. It failed in 2022 with the Mahsa Amini protests. And so when it comes to a war, that's a different issue, because there very likely will be another war, because Iran still has 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium dug underground, want to retrieve, but they've been unable to do so and are unwilling to do so for now. But build a new facility called Pickaxe Mountain near a previously established nuclear facility, and they want to build it up. And that will be where they actually try to reach 90% uranium enrichment. So, the stage is already set for a new war. And and trying to get equipment from the Chinese. So they're already preparing for the next stage of the conflict. So are the Israelis. So are the United States. So everything's in motion for it. I don't know when it will happen. Probably, obviously, after October. But there's going to be a very high chance of it happening within late 2025, early 2026. So keep an eye for that. And when it does happen, it's a good possibility. Will people go to the streets? I don't know, because there's not good leadership right now. The Iranian diaspora and the Iranian resistance, they don't actually have good leadership that can sort of be rallied around to like jettison that. And they don't
And
have.
why is that?
What are your thoughts on like the ability of there being a regime change or not?
Yeah, well, Ofer, I want to ask you just a follow-up question before I answer that. Why
Yeah.
don't they have a good leadership? Is it because of American leadership which are not supporting them? Is it because other countries are not acknowledging the Iranian resistance as a legitimate organization? Like, what is the holdup?
Well, first of all, because the resistance is far louder outside of Iran. So obviously they can't Iran. And the figurehead is, of course, Pahlavi, but
Mhm.
he not much by people within Iran. I would say make maximum 10% support him and want to return to the monarchy. Far more people, they are either reformists, meaning that they support the reform politicians in Iran, and that means that they're less inclined to be religious, and they care more about economic reforms, but they're still supportive generally of the current democratic system that officially they have with the elections and all that. But in terms of returning to the previous regime, most people don't support that. And of course, Iran has a very strong internal security apparatus with the IRGC and the Quds Force, and of course, in every single major city in the country that are there stationed in order to prevent an uprising, to prevent resistance groups from
Yeah.
forming that can actually fight against the government. So
Mhm.
it's like almost impossible to do it unless you form a group in the countryside where nobody's stopping you. And that's why there needs to be some level of external support in order for it to actually work. And then the only other option would be that the economy gets so bad that it's like there's like a literal drought and a literal famine everywhere. And only then could something really happen. But that would be a huge humanitarian catastrophe. And we're not at that point yet.
Yeah, and definitely, and to add on to your point, I do think that a big reason why the Green Revolution failed is because of the lack of support that came from outside of Iran, and we're kind of seeing that switch. We saw in the Green Revolution, Obama didn't support it, and now we see that Trump is potentially hinted at supporting a potential resistance, and obviously Netanyahu is supporting it. So maybe the outcome will be different. That's all we can hope for. And also to went on to your point about the effects that the nuclear enrichment strike, which happened, I believe, in June, if I'm not mistaken, had on Iran's capability of building up a nuclear weapon. I mean, I really do think that Iran, if they wanted to, could reach that 90% enrichment rate if they needed to. But right now, they just can't do so because of a diplomatic stance. When they reach the 90% uranium enrichment rate, that's when the United States is actually going to take action. That's when they're going to get involved.
Yeah.
And they know that if that happens, it's going to be very bad for them and the entire regime will collapse. I mean, do you agree? Like, do you think that they do have the capability? Am I wrong? Like, please.
Oh yeah, well, I'll talk about it in a technical manner. In Isfahan, the centrifuges and whatever stockpile of uranium was not destroyed underground. Only the above ground facilities were even targeted because the United States knew that it's like over 100 or 150 meters underground. They have the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium dug under the facility in Fordow. And so, yeah, currently they can't get it. They're going to try to get it at some point. And if they do and they have access to it, then after the entire process with the centrifuges, it can be enriched even further from 60% to 90%. They have that ability and they have the wherewithal, they have the knowledge, they have the
Yeah.
infrastructure in place to build up a new facility, which is what they're doing now with Pickaxe Mountain. So it's certainly possible. I don't think it can happen like in a fast amount of time. It would have to probably take them like a year or two to get it all finalized. But they're, like you said, and I agree with this completely, they're not going to do it right now because they know the moment they produce it and reach 90%, there's going to be a war that starts and they won't be able to stop it. The US will be intervening in it completely because it's a huge strategic threat to the United States and their interests. And so they prefer to be nuclear threshold, meaning that they have the ability to reach 90%, but they're staying away from it. And that way they have like leverage in negotiations. That's their current cares about the situation. And then once their eyes are focused elsewhere, that's when they'll produce the 90%. And that could take a while. That's sort of the long-term thinking of Iran.
Yeah, definitely. And to kind of move along and go back to our original topic, which was we were discussing the UN. There's a lot that happened obviously in the last few days. We saw Netanyahu's speech. We saw his emphasis on Iran, his emphasis on support, on calling out the countries who didn't support him. But we also saw new faces at the UN General Assembly, including the president or the newly elected, or however you want to call it, president of Syria. So he, obviously was on the bounty list for the United States. He had a $10 million bounty, and now he's having drinks with Donald Trump. So, what happened here? What are your thoughts about this? Is this guy a good guy? Is he a terrorist? Like, who is he?
He's not a good guy, but he is a rational actor, which is why the United States is willing to engage with him. So, as we all know the history, he joined the war in Iraq in 2003, and his name is, of course, Ahmad al-Shara, but his nickname is Julani. I think I'll just call him Shara for the purposes of this. He got arrested in 2006 for being a member of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he was detained there for 5 years. And during that, David Petraeus was the head of CENTCOM, meaning Central Regional Command, which is the United States' branch in the Middle East. And the funny thing is that over this past weekend, the two of them were sitting together and talking at a conference, and it was as if they were best friends. And he was literally the person who oversaw his detention for 5 years in prison. So he got released after that. He returned to Syria, where he became a prominent commander in a splinter group from al-Qaeda called al-Nusra. And then from there, he splintered off from al-Nusra and created HTS. And from there, he, of course, was able to take back Syria from the Assad regime in late 2024. So what's the interest in supporting him? Why is it being done? Right now, there's an influence effort by the Gulf states to try to ensure that he's captured by them as opposed to Turkey. So Saudi Arabia and Qatar are pouring in a lot of money into his coffers in order to ensure their stability and to try to push him away from the sphere of influence of Turkey. That's part of the objective.
Yeah.
Now, on the Israeli side, there's a concern that Turkish influence is increasing and that they're trying to build military bases over there. Turkey has a different group that they support in Syria called the SNA. But either way, they're trying to increase their footprint over there. And it's scary for Israel because then they would be on their northeastern border. So now they're working on a security arrangement between Syria and Israel. And it's in the later stages. Netanyahu said that it was certainly possible. But, it won't really happen until there's a sort of agreement about what's going on with the Druze, what's going on with the ethnic minorities in the southern border between the two countries, like where there's going to be a demilitarized zone and where Israel will have freedom of operation. But yeah, the United States also understands why it's important to let them back into the fold. So they did remove the Caesar sanctions that were put on Assad in 2017. And Trump, of course, met with Ahmad al-Shara when he visited the Middle East. And now he's, of course, speaking in the UN General Assembly as if his entire past as being a member of terrorist organizations was completely forgotten about. And that's the truth of the world. People don't care about morality. People are just doing these initiatives for their own self-interest. And he's just a proper example of that. You look at the way that Macron or Meloni, they don't care about his past. They're just trying to influence the future.
Yeah, definitely. And, HTS, for people who don't know what HTS is it used to be Al-Qaeda. It used to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda, practically was a part of their organization until they had a fallout of some sort and decided to split ways. It's not very clear why. I mean, the consensus is that, they wanted to take a less radical approach to governance. But the obvious thing with that is that if a guy once believed in Al-Qaeda, he's going to believe in Al-Qaeda again. like come on, the people don't change up on that. So in my perspective, HTS in general is an organization that, number one, should be labeled as a terrorist organization. And I'm pretty sure it is actually, or was at some point. And number two, it will do exactly what Al-Qaeda has done if it had the ability to do so. So if it had the funds, if it had the support from other Muslim Brotherhood countries, it would. But the thing is that obviously HTS is not supported by like Iran or any other big adversaries of the West because of their different type of Muslim. They also are very different in the way they're allocating it. The former regime, the Assad regime, was very supported by like Russia, for example. So he had funds, but now Syria's dead because there's no money. Who is paying them? And the answer to that is now the U.S. is paying them. The U.S. is paying them by lifting the sanctions, and they're hopefully going to get some economic momentum going. But my main concern from the very beginning of this is that under the Assad regime, it was horrible for the Syrian people. But at least we had some sort of stability. At least Israel wasn't being attacked every day, because if it was, then the Assad regime would face collapse. But now we have the complete opposite of stability, and we have a terror organization who would be willing to send soldiers and we harbor terrorists like Al Qaeda, for example, inside their borders and send them into Israel or send them into other Western countries. So, is this a concern? Is this a rational concern? Should Americans be concerned that terrorism is going to spread because of this?
Oh yeah, it's a huge concern to look at the current regime and who's leading it. Not just Ahmed al-Shara, but his defense minister and all of the new leaders in the Syrian army. They're all his former comrades and generals from HTS who had a history of all of the most gruesome war crimes from the entire Syrian civil war period when they ruled over Idlib
Yeah.
since 2019 with an iron fist. So those are the same people, and they said the same things. And they, at the time, talked about liberating Jerusalem, Al-Quds. That's something they talked about. Obviously, now they're not going to say anything about that because they're trying to be more rational and they want to survive. But you can't forget their origins. So they have an interest now in appearing to be moderates, and they actually will be in some ways because using leverage of sanctions relief.
Yeah.
Way they're trying to pressure a rational way. But we saw how the Syrian government was unable to stop the massacres of the Alawites on the western coast of Syria, and how during the summer they massacred hundreds of Druze civilians. So that can't be forgotten. There has to still be a safeguard against that, which is why the Druze are not going to disarm. They're still going to act as a leverage point to prevent full Syrian control
Well,
over all their territory.
yeah.
Yeah.
And just a few weeks ago, we saw that the Syrian government was massacring the Druze in large amounts, and it was terrible. And
Yeah.
Israel had to intervene, and that still is going on
Yeah.
to our knowledge, even if it's not publicized. The media is refusing to publicize it for some reason. You can only guess why, but this is the truth. Like, these people are not any better than Al Qaeda, and everyone has been complimenting, oh, it's such a big success that the Syrian Assad regime collapsed, but I don't know if this is much better. I mean, I get the standpoint of Trump. I get that he wants to give them a chance at least, but I don't know from their past, like, how much of a chance do they really deserve? They are terrorists, and my main concern is that they're going to harbor groups like Al Qaeda, and I don't know how much Donald Trump is going to be able to do about that.
Yeah, the problem is there just isn't an alternative right now because the alternative was Assad and he was allied with Iran. And with the fall of Assad, the entire airspace over Syria was open. Syria let Israeli jets fly over, they let refueling planes fly over, they let Israeli special forces land in Syria to reload and to replenish themselves or heading to Iran. The operation in Iran wouldn't even be feasible without the fall of Assad. So Israel greatly benefited from that regard. Now, that doesn't mean that there are other concerns looking long term, and that's why there are currently negotiations on a security arrangement with Syria. A collapse of Syria would be a huge issue because you're looking at a country with over 30 million people and so many different groups that are fighting each. So, yeah, the goal right now is to ensure their stability, and there aren't alternatives. The alternative would be ISIS. That's the only other group. And right now, the US is working with Syria to fight against ISIS. That's a huge issue right now, and I think Israel knows that. That's why they didn't kill him. They could have killed him if they wanted, but they let him stay because they understand that there are other options that could be even worse. And by the way, this sort of goes into the conversation with Turkey because Turkey is currently trying to get a footprint within the near Syria. So I wonder what you think about that initiative.
Yeah, well, Turkey in general, it's important to mention their history right now. And Turkey as a country is changing a lot in the last few years. It has went from a country that was relatively aligned to the United States, or it was definitely not neutral, to a country that right now is benefiting, is almost acting like an isolationist country. It's doing everything for itself. It's not very like one way or the other. It's not allied with Russia, but it's not allied with the United States. And that's why like I'm not really sure how much of a cause it is or benefit it is to have Turkey in NATO. It's a little bit confusing to me, and they're definitely not NATO aligned. And it's important to mention that they also like clearly in the conflict in Syria, they were not for the removal of the Assad regime, and that was a big deal. They're also aligned with Russia, so in general, Turkey is a very interesting player here. It's not an ally of the United States, at least I wouldn't consider it one, nor is it an enemy. But specifically relating to its potential influence that it could have in Syria, we have seen that like all Turkey wanted is more in influence in the Middle East. We have seen it time and time again, whether it's in Syria or any other part. Like Turkey is really trying to get some sort of stronghold in the Middle East, and to become a key player, whether it's an economic key player, whether it's a player that can deal with Israel or anything else. But I think it's very interesting, and if Turkey is able to recuperate their power and re-strengthen themselves to actually gain influence in Syria, it would be very interesting to see what their first actions would be. Again, Turkey is not a fan of Israel, but I don't think that they would ever launch a war against them. But over, what do you think about it?
Yeah, so Turkey absolutely does have revanchist attitudes. They want to at least have the perception that they are back to the glory days of the Ottoman Empire, and that includes influencing their southern neighbors, Iraq and Syria. Syria being the key player right now. So they tried to rebuild the T4 air base in central Syria, and it got destroyed by Israel. Right now, every single time that Turkey's trying to rebuild a facility and trying to get a permanent stranglehold over a certain area, Israel's just destroying it preemptively because they know once it's sort of seeped in, there won't be anything they can do about it without getting into a full blown war. So, what's Turkey's interest over here? Turkey, they are trying to act as a middleman to try to balance the competing greater powers. And that way, they're trying to feed off the differences in order to make themselves even more powerful. So that's why they're in NATO, absolutely, because they control the entrance to the Black Sea, which is important for NATO. NATO wants to have a country that they're allied with that controls the Bosphorus, controls the entry, the access to the Caucasus regions, meaning the border with Iran and Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, that entire region. A lot of important natural gas pipelines go through Turkey and then from there reach southeastern Europe.
Yeah.
So that's another really important perspective on it. Now, Turkey, it was supposed to be a part of the F-35 program, but it got kicked out in 2019 because they bought Russian S-400 air defense equipment. And so that shows how they were trying to balance it. Turkey was initially a part of the F-35 program, but Trump kicked them out in 2019. The S-400 air defense systems from the Russians. That again shows the balancing act, trying to diversify their military equipment so they're not reliant on one particular party. Now, they're pushing for it. And in recent years, Turkey has taken a slightly less pro-Russia stance. So that includes with the new agreement signed that we're going to get into now with, of course, the United States, but also the fact that they send a lot of military equipment to Ukraine. They also act as a neutral mediator between the countries during their peace efforts, and that started in 2022 and continued this year. The defense against Russia and in Ukraine, Turkey is extremely important. So there are a whole host of reasons. And I would say that in terms of defense spending and defense procurement, Turkey is probably the second strongest in all of NATO behind the United States. And so they have a huge pool of resources, both manpower wise and military wise, that they can use to do dirty work if
Yeah.
it ever reached that point. So, yeah, there are obviously reasons why it's a part of NATO, but what do you think of the liabilities of it? And also, what do you think of the recent deal between
Yeah.
Turkey and the United States?
So for the liabilities of Turkey, let's first say that. The thing is that Trump does not have leverage over them because Turkey is, again, positioning itself as an independent source. It is not positioning like we need Turkey more than Turkey needs us, in my perspective at least. I mean, obviously the United States is very important, but Turkey has Russia, Turkey could have China, Turkey could have every other nation because of its strategic importance. So that's first off, in my opinion, the biggest liability with Turkey. But of course, like Turkey is very important, and we need to have a strategic relationship and diplomatic relationship. And a big reason of why Turkey actually became a powerful country as it is now is because of the United States. So it's right to continue the relationship. But to talk about the potential deal, now we seen in just the last week, Turkey actually signed multiple deals. It wasn't just a military deal. It was also a deal to buy gas from the United States. It was a deal that there was some talk about relieving some sort of sanctions on Turkey. So all of this is, like, from an economic standpoint, also very good if this actually could happen, because it would mean that Turkey and the United States again partner each other up, and there's economic benefit to that. But going into the deal that probably has the most weight, which we saw the Turkish president and Donald Trump speak about, it had multiple parts, but definitely nuclear weapons had to be a significant factor of why the deal was being made. And we have seen that Trump is very scared in general for other countries that aren't necessarily best friends of the United States to get nuclear weapons. That's why Iran is, Iran, Fordham or whatever in Iran is a Faudo, whatever whatever that
Yeah.
location is called. It's now non-existent. So he obviously doesn't want countries to get nuclear weapons. So I think that was really the emphasis of the deal. I mean, that's why it's strategically important. But what are your thoughts? Like, I mean, you said that this was such an important deal, and I agree with that. I think it's important, but why does this deal in particular stand out to you as for any other peacemaking deals that Trump has made in the past?
Because I think it symbolizes now formally that there is a transition by Turkey away from Russia. If you look at the terms of the deal, for instance, you have that Turkish pipeline company that they've now pledged to import 6 billion cubic meters worth of American LNG for the next 20 years. So that's extremely big, because right now you look at the gas imports that Turkey intakes, and 40% of them are from Russia. And having this deal with the United States as a starting point, they're going to reduce their reliance on Russia and buy
Mhm.
from the US, meaning the US will make a profit. And then they're going to send those, of course, shipments to themselves. They're going to use it for their own country, but also to give it to Europe. And that
Yeah,
way, Southeastern Europe will also be less reliant on the Russians. So it's a huge win for American energy dominance and a huge loss for the Russians, because it's one of their major customers, besides obviously India and China. That's one thing. There was a deal with Boeing to buy 200 new planes from Boeing. So that's going to be great for the shareholders if you own the stock. There's the agreement, like you said, on the nuclear power. So they're going to work on strengthening cooperation on their civilian nuclear power programs, which is very good, because a big fear for the United States is nuclear proliferation, meaning that there is like no more taboo about creating nuclear weapons. That each country now can do it if they so choose. They just wants to ensure that nobody has the ability to create it in the future. And so, by the United States having like a footprint in the civilian nuclear energy program in Turkey, they can sort of have influence over it and ensure that it remains that way. And it's
exactly.
also good for the US, yeah, because we need nuclear energy. We have way too many regulations on it, and it would be a great way to diversify our energy outputs. And instead of going with this Green New Deal scam energy, like wind turbines and solar panels, nuclear energy is the way, I believe, as long as it's being done in a safe manner. And yeah, I think that there's also the thing with Turkey now, they're pushing to rejoin the F-35 program.
Yeah,
That's another important point, because they currently have F-16s, they don't have F-15s, but they want the F-35s. And the US was very reluctant to do so. But if they reduce the reliance on Russian energy, they might actually agree to incorporate Turkey into the deal. Now, Israel hates this, because Israel has something called a strategic edge over all of its neighbors right now, due to it being the only country in the F-35 program. And so having Turkey join into it now, it would change the balance of power and put them on equal footing for the first time. So there's going to be a huge blowback from the Israel lobby on the issue. And that's why I'm not sure if that will actually end up coming into fruition.
yeah, and also Turkey, time and time again, has refused to actually follow through with the F-35 deal. We have seen that literally they were buying weapons from Russia when they were supposed to buy weapons from the United States. So maybe that will also play a factor into the fact that he's not getting any deal from the U.S. But to move on from Turkey, there has been real breaking news, and that is that James Comey has officially been indicted by the Department of Justice. And for reference, James Comey, the former FBI director under Obama and Trump in his first term, uh, has a lot of scandals going for him. And specifically the timing is very important here too, because his statute of limitations for all of his crimes were to expire on Tuesday, I believe. So it was no surprise to anyone
It's
that,
close.
yeah, it's very, very,
Yeah.
very close. So they waited until the last minute, and most likely the reason for that was that there were a lot of crimes where their statute of limitations already expired. So they were trying to find out to see if it even meant to prosecute him, because if he can't get prosecuted for half the stuff that he did, then what's the point? So that was, I think, the argument. Also, they were trying to, like, he was indicted by a grand jury. It wasn't Donald Trump that just flipped the switch. It
Yeah.
was a grand jury through a normal court procedure that indicted him. So they needed to look over all the evidence, which took months. So it's understandable. But what are your thoughts on this? I mean, first off, let's get started on what James Comey actually did. So I don't know if you want to give a rundown. I can too, but yeah, just
Yeah, sure. And then fill in any gaps if I miss something. But my understanding is that Comey opened up with the Russia investigation starting in August of 2016, and
mhm,
then it ramped up after Trump won the election. Now, during that time period, they started looking into the potential collusion between Russia and Donald Trump. And so there were accusations levied at Comey about not operating by the book and malfeasance and trying to do things for politically motivated reasons. So he had this network of people that were in his inner circle that he fed stories to. He fed them narratives and he authorized them to anonymously leak out information to the press, like the New York Times and the Washington Post. And they did this for numerous stories over a very long period of time, even during Trump's presidency, while he was in office and while he was fighting with Comey in the beginning of 2017. And even after Comey got fired in May, he still continued giving out information to these people. So that's one conversation, the fact that some of that information may be classified. But what's actually important for this case is the fact that he was asked in 2017 about whether he ever gave authorization to FBI sources to anonymously give out leaks to the media. And he said no. And then again, 2020, they asked him again if that was true. And yet again, he reaffirmed his statements. And so it's been proven now by the FBI, the new FBI director, Kash Patel, that he actually did allow that to happen. And we have names of the people that were in the inner circle
yeah.
that did that. And so that would be a lie. That was false testimony. And it would also be obstruction of the investigation, the Senate's investigation into the matter. So those are the two charges. And do you think there's actually a good chance that he gets convicted of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have to remember where these cases are going to be tried, and he's going to try for moving this case to a district like Washington D.C., which he could. I see a possibility, especially now the current judge assigned to the case is a Biden-appointed judge, which is important to mention. So it's possible that he will move it to Washington D.C., and if he does, I mean, I really just can't see an outcome of him getting convicted. I also think that in general, the crimes that he is like indicted for are significant, but they're very difficult to prove in a way of, with no reasonable doubt. They're crimes that almost no one gets charged for. And like, even I'm questioning like how much political persecution, like whether this is political persecution, because look, I have no doubt about it. He committed the crimes, but if his name wasn't James Comey, would he be prosecuted for it? I don't know. I mean, I haven't made up my mind, but what I do know is that a grand jury indicted him. So it wasn't Donald Trump
Yeah.
that led the charges. It was a grand jury that was impartial, that had nothing to do with Donald Trump. So that is the main emphasis I want to point out here. So also, adding on to that, he didn't get a house raid or anything. The FBI didn't raid his house. No, no CNN at 2 a.m. like for Roger Stone, or and that just goes to show that there's such a different, like, under Biden, we were in a country that was truly in a country of crisis, where people were arrested for no reason. in the middle of the night, and now we, let someone who actually committed a crime just turn themselves in or something. So I mean, it's ironic, but look, I don't think that the Trump administration should be commenting on this. I think it's a judicial matter, not a political matter. But I am in favor of justice being served, and if he committed the crimes, he should do the time for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should note that the grand jury, they were given 3 charges, and one of them they dropped. It was another false testimony allegation, but 2 of them they obviously looked at and said, "Okay, these ones actually have merits." So
Mhm.
clearly they had like a rigorous process of determining what could actually be eligible and what wasn't. And so 2 of them actually were voted on and approved, as you said. And so that's important. I think that, yeah, we mentioned the Biden administration, their malfeasance, their wrongdoing, how they went after Trump with those 2 federal cases, and Jack Smith, the special counsel, was leading them for a very long time. The 2 other cases locally that you had collaboration between the Biden DOJ and the local districts. Of course, you had all of the political persecution and prosecution against Peter Navarro, Steve Bannon, Mark Meadows, like all of the other Trump lawyers for like the Georgia RICO case and January 6th, like subpoenas that people didn't show up for. So like they were very petty with that. And so Trump's just returning the favor to many of the people that did it to him with
Yeah.
Jack Smith.
Look,
Yeah, and
I don't agree with returning the favor in general, but it's very understandable in this case. Number one. Number two, they committed a far worse crime than Donald Trump did. I mean, because their impact wasted billions of dollars in taxpayer money. The investigation into the 2016 election because of the Russiagate hoax was like the Mueller invest report was, I think it cost taxpayers like $60 million a year to run. And it was a 3-year run thing. I mean, it's ridiculous. So, and it swayed votes, and in the 2020 election. So I think it's crazy, and people deserve to be punished for it because it's not something that should happen in America.
yeah, absolutely. And so Comey's the first one. We're going to see how the reaction is and whether it's successful. I think it could drag out for a very long time because I'm sure he's going to try to appeal it afterwards. And we can then look at other cases. Trump probably will want to go after Letitia James in the same way, the same rigorous way we talked about in an earlier episode. And then Adam Schiff. He hates Adam Schiff. Like
Oh,
he
I
calls
hate
him
that.
Schiff. Yeah. And he has his own mortgage fraud scandal that we haven't even talked about, but they're going to try to investigate him for that.
Yeah, I
So
mean, he's a
another thing.
disgusting look. His central platform is to pack the court. So anyone who wants to pack the court and will never get my support. So if he could be another, FDR or something. But look, I really think that he's a horrible. Just nothing is good about. I can't say one good thing about him. I don't think he's good at all, and he he would be the reason for the downfall of our country if he, let's say, he became president somehow. Like I would have no doubt about it that our country would fall under his presidency. And you see him speaking with people like Gavin Newsom as if they're best friends, and
Yeah.
Karen Bass as if they're also best friends. So it's so scary to think that these people are probably going to be running in the primaries of the Democrat, election for president. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to watch. But yeah, this episode has been really filled with a lot of information here. I mean, everything has been going on in the last few days. So thank you guys for watching, and yeah, we'll see you next time on the Patriot Perspective.
Thank you all. Goodbye.